Thanks, Dan and sepideh, and thanks everyone for coming. Nice to see some old friends and comrades among the participants. So this is intended, as far as I understand, as a relatively informal presentation, discussion, seminar. So I'll treat it as such. And in that vein, though I'm supposed to be taking up the first hour or so speaking, if at any point you wish to interject, raise questions, etc., please do. Might even help me proceed to more significant or interesting areas of this theme. As I'm sure all of you have experienced, this kind of online engagement has its own alienation effects, amongst which maintaining momentum and rhythm to discussion is definitely one, right? So maybe I thought I'd start by, since you've had the text and since you've been able to read them, and I'm not going to repeat or retread that material, at least not directly, I thought I'd start just by making some more general comments about what generated my interest in the theme of the concept, the debate around real abstraction, what the kind of investigative threads and problems that I see clustering around this idea of real abstraction might be, and also perhaps what some of the problems or dilemmas that I tried to raise in those articles and that might still remain open are. And part of this is the reflections that were kind of generated by trying to put a number of these articles together for the publication. So yes, just in these past year, I put together a number of these articles for publication with the Chilean publisher Palinodia. So it was kind of an opportunity to try to also think through some of the themes, convergences, etc., across these articles, and also quite honestly some of their limitations, impasses, etc. So I suppose there's a fairly obvious conjunctural context for this. My real theoretical intellectual interest in the debate on real abstraction in Sohn-Rethel, but then in a whole galaxy of thinkers either directly influenced by him or having parallel kind of projects of inquiry. This sort of crystallized or came together unsurprisingly around 15 years ago, is it? Yeah, or a little less. And though I'd read Sohn-Rethel before, partly via Zizek, partly actually via Paolo Viedno in Italian debates, Sohn-Rethel was translated and debated quite intensely in the late 70s in Italy, including in the pages of the far left newspaper Lotta Continua. The point of crystallization, I guess, for me of these questions was really unsurprisingly around the 2007-8 credit crunch, financial crisis, etc. And part of it was really a response to the way in which Marx's quip, I think from the third volume of Capital about capital being the religion of everyday life, came home in a very immediate and intense way. Not least in the manner in which extremely abstruse financial instruments, indicators, and processes became a matter of quotidian debate. Whether it was people in Italy discussing in English what they called lo spread, so the spread, but with the Italian article, to discuss the difference in yields between Italy's 10-year bonds and Germany's, or the fact that credit default swaps or collateralized debt obligations were a matter of daily debate and the like. The incursion, let's say, into everyday life with massive both personal and national and social consequences of capital's abstractions was very evident. Now, of course, this can lead to all sorts of different inquiries, and it's not necessarily obvious that the kind of debates laid out, for instance, in Sohn-Rethel, would be of immediate interest to resolving these issues, but that was sort of the wager, and it was a wager that was kind of generated, I suppose, also by the ways in which this kind of conjuncture intersected with a much longer term interest, basically in the kind of Althusserian question, right? Is it possible to be a Marxist in philosophy, or exactly what might that mean or entail? And in many ways, that was my my point of entry, really, into the debate on real abstraction as such, was really to try to figure out, to try to articulate what not just what Marxist approach or historical materialist approach to philosophy might be, and what the limitations of extant approaches were, but more particularly, it was to see if there were different avenues to address a question that I personally had first encountered in actually in Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy, right? The question of what a materialist account of the origins of philosophy, of the putative Greek origins of philosophy, or origins of Western philosophy, might be. And there was I think the formulation in that section of Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy is that they speak of a principle of contingent reason rather than a principle of sufficient reason. In many ways, what they try to do is to suspend something that, having studied in the domain of so-called continental philosophy for some years, I'd found increasingly insufferable, which was the sort of piety and the numinous character that had been lent to the Greek origins of philosophy, especially, let's say, in the kind of Heideggerian dimensions of continental philosophy, and that, so the first the stimulus of that very brief section, to be fair, of Deleuze and Guattari's What is Philosophy was considerable, because it really suggested the notion of the emergence of philosophy that is traditionally conceived in Europe and the West as a kind of aleatory encounter of sorts, without necessarily providing the most detailed or richest analysis thereof, but nevertheless, the origins in immanence of Greek philosophy in relationship to the specificities of Greek history and the like. And it was in that kind of frame that I read, now I can't quite recall when, Sohn-Rethel's Intellectual and Manual Labor. And specifically, the identification in that book, not simply of the economic or political economic conditions or substructure of the emergence of philosophy, but of the problem of form. And this is something that I do think for its you know, for its limitations, still remains very significant in the discussion, as I tried to lay it out in the piece in HM, the discussion of Sohn-Rethel and real abstraction in Zizek's sublime object of ideology. I think, again, I tried to lay out what I think might be the limits of that in the piece that I sent you. But what I do think is of great significance is the identification by Sohn-Rethel in Intellectual and Manual Labor of the singularity of a Marxian approach to the origins of philosophy, understood not, and I think this is key, as a reduction of philosophical form to social content, but as the ability to correlate the forms taken by philosophy, the forms taken by philosophical concepts to the forms of economic practice, right, or of socioeconomic practice. And therefore it was that gesture, that move, so to speak, of the reduction, not the reduction, but the correlation of a form to a form, and not of a form to a content. And therefore the putting aside of, or at least the bracketing of a certain limited and limiting consideration of what a Marxist history of philosophy would involve, right? The Marxist history of philosophy being, you know, the history of how various class and social formations found their legitimation or expression, distorted or otherwise, in philosophical texts, right? So then, you know, philosophy as a kind of particularly recondite and refined product of class ideology. This is not, of course, what Sohn-Rethel proposes. What instead he proposes is, and I think the formulation in Zizek remains useful, the scandal of a form of thought external to that thought. Therefore, you know, opening up the connection to a whole discussion of the unconscious, which I won't necessarily go into here, but which obviously Zizek minds at length with the supposed, and I think somewhat tenuous, homologies between a Marx read through Sohn-Rethel and a Freud read through Lacan. So I think that, you know, that in many ways was the starting point, and I think there is a kind of, at least to me, liberating, freeing effect to advancing an approach, a methodology to thinking the relationship between philosophy and Marxism, or philosophy and historical materialism, that doesn't take the form of simply correlating philosophical texts or philosophical schools or philosophical concepts to particular arrangements of class social formations. Which always reminds me of this anecdote, which I've never checked, from Badiou mentioning some Soviet encyclopedia of philosophy, which in one edition under the entry, Plato simply had ideologue of the slave society, full stop, end of, you know, end of discussion, end of story. Okay, so that's, that I guess is the, is one of the sort of starting points for looking at this debate on real abstraction, right? So, and I guess the wager was to think, you know, is it possible to link this effort in Sohn-Rethel and in related perspectives that have a certain affinity with it to create a kind of, you know, sort of genesis and analysis of philosophy, which is both formal and historical in kind, and not sort of reductive to social content. Is that, you know, is it possible to then articulate that with those problems of what I called, citing Marx, the religion of everyday life, right? And this is, in a sense, to open up the whole problematic of to what extent is capital the harbinger of a kind of practically existing metaphysics, right? And to what extent, if one counts oneself or thinks of oneself as a practitioner or student of a kind of speculative philosophy, should one's interest actually turn towards or converge upon the abstractions in the social forms of capital, rather than philosophical abstractions understood as some kind of special and recondite and sublime sort of property, right, of philosophers themselves. A lot of this, you know, a lot of, I suppose, as a matter of, you know, not quite confession, but avowal, let's say, you know, a lot of the interest also in this came, as I was trying to suggest, vis-a-vis the break with a kind of Greek, you know, miracle refrain. A lot of the attraction to this came from breaking with the sort of self-sufficient pieties of philosophy as a discipline, right? As a discipline that regards itself as somehow concerned with first things and somehow rising above the you know, the empirical distractions and divagations of other inquiries and other disciplines. And I think, again, the scandalous nature of the proposal of real abstraction, the scandalous proposal that actually speculation might happen in a much more intense and complex and forbidding sense outside of the minds and indeed texts of philosophers, and indeed in the reality and machinations of capital itself, I think was, you know, kind of worth staying with. And I suppose then, once, you know, having kind of been, you know, found a kind of catalyzing effect in that sort of perspective from Sohn-Rethel, then that also led to seeing a number of philosophical debates and philosophical perspectives or theoretical perspectives that I encountered before in that light, right? And some of that I've only sketched in kind of texts here and there, but I think it's possible, for instance, to return to texts again, like very much like Deleuze and Guattari's Capitalism and Schizophrenia volumes in this light. In fact, I think it's very potentially very fruitful, right, to transcode French debates from the 1970s, including the quite intense debates that see, you know, the sort of crossfire between Deleuze and Guattari and Baudrillard and Lyotard around the mid-70s, right? Debates that are mobilized by transformations in the nature of capitalist abstraction, not least the significance of credit and money. Those debates, I think, viewed from the perspective of how they articulate in a specific conjuncture a kind of practically existing metaphysics, become much richer. It's also possible, of course, in a more restricted or limited sense, to extend the purview of Sohn-Rethel's arguments to a whole number of thinkers that were like him, either with, you know, in the orbit of or within the Frankfurt School itself. It's something that I've only touched upon, but of course the encounter with Sohn-Rethel's work, though he was sort of rather systematically and at times dismayingly marginalized by Horkheimer in particular, but it was the encounter of the notion of real abstraction, or the notion of what Sohn-Rethel called social synthesis, was very significant for Adorno, as we know from the correspondence that Sohn-Rethel and Adorno had from the 1920s all the way to Adorno's death. And so again, I think it's also possible to return to familiar, at times dismayingly familiar or sterile debates within the domain of critical theory, more strictly conceived through this particular lens. In so doing, then one also kind of realizes that there were projects parallel and distinct from Sohn-Rethel's that also put this problem of real abstraction very much on the line. Very recently, I was reading Henri Lefebvre's work from the 1930s. Lefebvre actually at the time, especially because he was writing with Norbert Gutermann, having already some actual connections with the Institute for Social Research. He reviews books for the Zeitschrift for Sozialforschung in the 30s. Gutermann is a kind of an associated member of the Frankfurt School even at that time. And if one reads La Conscience Mystifiée, which is from the book from the 1930s, one sees actually remarkable convergence there in the attempt to rethink the history of philosophy in view of the conception of practical or real abstraction, and therefore in ways that then Lefebvre will carry out later. I'm thinking in particular of his book on Pascal from the 1950s, to rethink and rewrite the history of philosophy as a history of the mutations in this kind of practically existing metaphysics and the ways in which it is conceptually registered. Yeah, and I think in that sense, then we can, I guess my suggestion is that we can revisit a number of pivotal or crucial debates and moments in the history of 20th century Marxist philosophy, or philosophy for Marxism, however you want to put it, in light of the problems sketched by Sohn-Rethel. Of course, in full knowledge of the remarkable partialities, right, and limitations also of that project. You know, on the one hand, limitations in terms of its explorations or understandings in a way of the history of ancient philosophy's relationship to economic form, on which there is much significant research, especially more recently, but also limitations which of course have been the main object, which perhaps we can discuss at greater length, but the main object of Marxian critique, which is mainly, you know, the rather glaring fact that, of course, Sohn-Rethel's account of real abstraction and accounts of the origins of Greek philosophy is the account of the origins of philosophy in the unconscious practice of commodity exchange in a non-capitalist society, right, in ancient Greece. And there are a lot of issues attendant to transposing or transcoding the account of the link between philosophy and real abstraction, or practically existing metaphysics, let's say, in intellectual and manual labor, to contexts that are, so to speak, kind of fully capitalist, right? So this is, you know, in many ways, the fact that for Sohn-Rethel, abstraction takes place, if not solely, at least principally, in the domain of circulation and exchange, in ways that seem to be rather tenuously linked, if at all, to you know, what many, Moishe Postone, Anselm Japp, and others have identified as the critical nexus for Marxian understanding of abstraction, namely the theoretical understanding and historical emergence of abstract labor, right? Which is not something that can be reasonably projected onto ancient Greek society. And that, of course, is one of that question of the relationship between abstraction within the domain of exchange and abstraction within the the hidden abode of production, so to speak, is, I think, obviously one of the very distinct problems, enigmas, dilemmas, points of theoretical dispute in the domain of around these debates of real abstraction. I suppose the third axis, at least in terms of my my own interest, the third axis of preoccupation with this issue of real abstraction, beyond the purely philosophical one, and an effort to really think what this idea of the religion of everyday life might have to do with our indebted and financialized present, has to do with a domain that we can very loosely refer to as aesthetic, right? Or a domain which I really tried to foreground via Althusser's, I think, remarkable engagement with the Italian painter Leonardo Cremonini at the end of that piece from Textual Practice. It's very striking that the debates, or at least the many of the more recent uptakes of this problem of real abstraction, of this problem of practically existing metaphysics, trespass into or shade into debates about the representability of capital or capitalism, which is, for me at least is an interest in its own right, which I've dealt with elsewhere. But I think certainly, and that was my kind of intention in trying to look at that Cremonini piece more closely, I think is extremely significant, right, to the debate on real abstraction, which is a debate that has to do really with the intelligibility of form, right, with the intelligibility and therefore also the visibility or perceptibility of form, and that's marked very much in that final quote. I think the quote that I finished the Textual Practice piece, or the other one, or both, I can't remember, from Althusser's. Which text is that? Yeah, from his infamous preface to Capital Volume 1, right? That's a preface where Althusser tells us not to read all of the sections on value, much to the immense horror and chagrin of value form theorists everywhere, but where he also identifies or raises this problem, right, of visibility, and where he writes, every abstract concept therefore provides knowledge of a reality whose existence it reveals. An abstract concept then means a formula which is apparently abstract but terribly concrete because of the object it designates. This object is terribly concrete in that it is infinitely more concrete, more effective. So this is the thing that I for me, and I like this formulation regardless of Althusser's value iconoclasm, because of the specific way in which it brings home, right, that that real abstraction is also a claim about social efficacy and the power of those structures and processes that are precisely formal, right, and not a matter of immediately perceivable content. So he says, this object is terribly concrete in that it is infinitely more concrete, more effective than the objects one can touch with one's hands or see with one's eyes, and yet one cannot touch it with one's hands or see it with one's eyes. Simply speaking, in order to be able to analyze these concrete capitalist societies, England, France, Russia, etc., it is essential to know that they are dominated by that terribly concrete reality, the capitalist mode of production, which is invisible to the naked eye, invisible, i.e. abstract. And I guess a lot of my my interest in that whole set of debates that can be kind of loosely captured through Fred Jameson's notion of cognitive mapping has to do with really, unpacking this very compressed formula, right? Vis-a-vis capital and its determinations. Invisible, i.e. Abstract. And I think that, that's where the very nuanced, if slippery formulations in Althusser regarding the ways in which Cremonini makes absences, both positive absences, the positive absence of capital as it structures social relations, and negative absences, the absence of man, capital M, from Cremonini's paintings, that I found sort of particularly striking. And it also resonated with me in terms of my kind of fascination, I suppose, with the various efforts by visual artists and filmmakers to tackle not just the representability of capital as a social relation, but the representability of capital, Karl Marx's book, right? So some of you might have read those fascinating notes that Eisenstein writes for his doomed project to film Das Kapital, doomed alongside his other project, of course, to film Joyce's Ulysses. So perhaps he should have filmed them together. And those passages are particularly striking, right? Because what are the methods, and they're often methods of laterality or indirection or anamorphosis that allow one, right, to make a structuring absence or a structuring invisibility present, and that therefore raise the, to me, quite fascinating issue of what would a realism of this abstraction be, right? A realism which is not a sentimental realism, to use a formulation from Alan Sekula, right? It's not a realism that tries to mirror or capture the appearance of capital's effects, but which somehow is a realism of those very structures and form determinations which are not as such open to perception, right? And so I think that that then becomes quite to my mind, striking problem, and it's striking in part also because it opens in part a sort of political reflection, right, about what are the efficacies and the role of theory vis-a-vis other forms of intelligibility or representation, right? So one of the questions that one can always raise regarding these problems of the representability of or visibility of capital is that why would one need anything other, right, than the theory? Why would one need to make palpable, to make tangible? This is a problem I think that is also very much present in Jameson's own account of cognitive mapping, who at times then codes this in terms of the necessity for the intelligibility of capital to translate itself in a kind of affective or corporeal knowledge, or and then this especially in the cognitive mapping scenario, this leads really to the question of what mobilizes a theory, right, or what mobilizes is towards praxis, and does that require, right, an aesthetic? Does that require an aesthetic of the economy? Does that require a making perceptible of these otherwise invisible or structural relations? What does that mean in terms of capital functioning not just as a community in the way that Marx talks about it in the Grundrisse, right? The community that has abolished all other communities, the Gemeinwesen that has sort of captured, refunctioned, or evacuated all other ones, but also as a kind of sensus communis, right? As a kind of sensorium. And that to me is, remains quite an interesting problem. Now, maybe moving towards a sort of conclusion of sorts, at least to this part of things. I guess two further issues that I think are, that are alluded to in those articles that I think are maybe fruitful for sort of further discussion. One which I think can be seen to run as at times an antinomy, at times a dilemma, or maybe just a tension in a lot of the theorizing around abstraction, is whether abstraction should be conceived of as an evacuation, an emptying out of social or experiential content, and to what extent instead real abstraction is to be thought of as a capture, refunctioning, and rearticulation, right, of difference or social difference or differentiation. This is something that I was trying to foreground as in that piece in HM that deals with some of Zizek's writings, amongst other things, because I think in many ways he's a very, I was going to say symptomatic, let's just say symptomatic, why not, keep the pun, very symptomatic figure in this regard, right? Because on the one hand, there's a grasp, I think, and a very astute grasp of the problem of real abstraction as formulated by Sohn-Rethel, but then a way of linking that to what I think is a very limited and in fact very misleading conception of what capitalist abstraction entails, which I called for as a kind of shorthand, the sort of the model of the Communist Manifesto, right? The model of abstraction, the icy waters of calculation, et cetera, the abstraction that obliterates difference, the abstraction that allows Engels in the Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844 to make the argument that industrial capitalism basically creates practical atheism, right? That somehow what capital does is just remove the binds, the bonds, the links, the identities, and so on and so forth. Now we have, almost 2 centuries of history to put that, I think, unhelpful thesis to rest, which is not to, deny, right, by any means, the destructive, the voiding abilities that that subsumption under capital generates, but to, I think, foreground instead the rearticulation or refunctioning of the capture, rearticulation, and refunctioning of difference that is a much more significant dimension of abstraction. In a more facetious, maybe anecdotal mode, I've always been struck by the obsession of certain theorists of abstraction with, for instance, the loss of culinary difference, right? You can just read Guy Debord's obsession with the way in which, one of the salient traits of the society of the spectacle is, the obliteration of, the quality and difference, of French wines and meats, for instance. I mean, I was reading Debord's correspondence. There's this amazing sort of section of letters, amongst other things, where he's trying to, this is in the 70s, right? So it's kind of a real, really prophetic. He's trying to source organic beef, I kid you not, at great length from this one guy somewhere inside. And he sends them, he's writing these brutal letters to all of these, you know, people he's excommunicating and the like. And the level of sort of politeness, gentleness, and rhetorical flourish that he puts to like trying to get this enormous side of organic beef from this guy, at the same time as he's, you know, of course, berating contemporary capitalism for destroying the possibility of everyday enjoyment, is quite striking. Roberto Finelli, in another text, I think published in Historical Materialism, tries to correlate his theory of abstraction to the fact that chicken no longer has any taste and the like. I say this not just because of the, you know, amusement of it, but because I think it's actually a symptom, right, of what I think is a kind of fallacy. Fallacy that was you know, probably I experienced more from having lived in England for 20 years, where I think the more intense incursions of capital expanded its culinary possibilities rather than restricted them, but that's a different matter, right? In any case, I think that there is this tendency, right? This tendency to think that somehow the imposition of capitalist abstraction has a legible and direct effect on the evacuation of quality and difference from social life. I just think that is wrong. Again, not, and I think it makes it, I think that perspective makes impossible to think the interaction and rearticulation that capital and capitalist abstraction generates in terms of social differences and identities, in terms of gender and racialization, in terms of things that, you know, in a previous moment, as I tried to point out in the article, Zizek was actually, you know, quite astutely able to grasp, for instance, the relationship between nationalism and market exchange, democracy, and capitalist abstraction and the like. So I think, and that's why I think perspectives that are much more, you know, that are much more sensitive to, or which pay much more attention to this ability to occupy and refunction and rearticulate difference. I'm thinking of some of Stuart Hall's writings on Marx and method, and indeed his writings specifically on Althusser, Gramsci, and race and the like are much more successful in that regard. And I suppose lastly, and maybe this is one we can draw this part to a close, I think the other aspect of this, which I think is worth stressing or worth kind of dwelling on, is the ways in which, and this I suppose is partly what attracted me to this debate, the way that there is a refunctioning of the relationship between materialism and idealism, right? In Marxist and philosophical debate. So one of the, you know, starting points for this was, of course, the ways in which across a whole set of Marxological debates, people have, of course, identified Hegelian logic as, you know, the, you know, guiding structure for much of Marx's speculations in Capital and elsewhere, signaled perhaps more effectively by some notation of Lenin in his philosophical notebooks, signaling, you know, the superiority of good idealism to stupid materialism or to vulgar materialism, the like. And I tried in the piece from Textual Practice in a way to identify in two, well, in three contributions in particular, ways of thinking through this, right? So one was Etienne Balibar's, effort to think of Marx's the specificity of Marx, beginning, in fact, with the earlier Marx, as a thinker of a materialism without matter, or as a thinker of a materialism of praxis. And here we could link that concept of practice also to the unconscious practice of the market exchangers that Sohn-Rethel was talking about. And then Isaak Rubin's effort to distinguish between what he called material categories and social forms, and therefore to critique classical political economy for, again, a kind of bad or vulgar materialism that, for instance, treats human labor as a transhistorical constant. And lastly, to consider the Gramsci's critique of Bukharin from the notebooks, right? In very different ways across those different registers, there's a suggestion of the limitations of precisely of a materialism of matter. And that again, relates to that question, the aesthetic question as well, right? The question of what is perceivable or visible about capital. What does it mean to, as Marx says, that not an atom of matter goes into value? What does it mean that the visibly same product, right? The visibly same object and the materially identical object potentially created in a capitalist economy and in a non-capitalist economy means that indiscernible objects at the level of their material composition, one can be in a commodity and one cannot be, and none of this is open for perception or sensibility as such. Now, I think the possibility that then one might look for one's materialist methods in idealist philosophy, and one might find in philosophies that posit a primary matter, materialisms that are really idealisms, I think is suggestive and links again to that kind of slogan from Adorno that I found quite stimulating, the idea that what one needs is a last philosophy rather than a first philosophy, right? Which I also take in the vein of also in the vein of a critique or a kind of polemic against the return of that as a desire, right? As a desire for philosophy, or as a desire for theory in general. The notion that what we need is more first philosophies, right? A notion that I think is relatively widespread these days, and that I think in many ways the problematic of real abstraction can help to at least put into question, right? By in a sense suggesting that all first philosophies are idealist, including, and at times specifically, the ones that posit that firstness as being matter, right? Okay, so I think I will pause my ramblings, and maybe we can take like a 5-minute break, as I think sepideh or Dan suggested, and then we can open it up for a discussion.
So thank you, Alberto, for the talk so far. That was great. For the second part, I think we want to be a bit more interactive. Everybody is encouraged to turn on their camera as the first thing. Second, you are free to ask questions. You can unmute yourself and ask the question live, or if you prefer, you can just type it in the chat. But it's best if your camera is on and you can ask the question live to Alberto. And with this, we can probably start by going to a couple of questions in the chat. So Alberto, if you want to go through the chat and if you want to comment on any of the questions in there, please feel free to do so.
So yeah, no, thanks, Ralph, for the mention of. I should have probably mentioned Richard Seaford's work, which was extremely stimulating, and which I encountered after seeing what had been made of the arguments for, rather cruder arguments, granted, first advanced by George Thompson, who was a close friend, I think, of Sohn-Rethel. And in fact, I commissioned a piece from Seaford about Sohn-Rethel, which is, because he does mention him, not in the book that's discussed here, which I have not read, but in the book Money and the Early Greek Mind, I believe it's called, earlier book of Seaford's, where he does briefly note, for all of the historical limits and methodological problems, he does note Sohn-Rethel as a kind of precursor of sorts. And certainly, the issue of what one does with a supposed specificity of Greece and the supposed specificity of that philosophical tradition is certainly worth staying with. I think. I think Catherine Cummings' point is very well taken. I think I think it's definitely not not simply an either or between a kind of movement of evacuation and one of recoding. I guess there's various ways of seeing this, right? One, which I think would be you could find, at least in certain aspects of Roberto Finelli's writing, is one in which the evacuation basically turns differences, social and otherwise, into simulacra of sorts, and therefore what then comes to be recoded is already, let's say, a shell of its pre or non-capitalist self. I think that that view would be problematic in as much as it would require thinking of something like a real subsumption or a full pervasiveness of capital and of capitalist social relations across the whole of across every and each life world, right? I think that's a problematic perspective, and I think it's interesting maybe also to reflect on the ways in which debates about abstraction and debates about real abstraction do or do not assume, right, or presuppose something like a kind of somewhat metaphysical reading, let's say, of capital's totalizing abilities, right? And and so to treat, to treat, kind of evacuation of substantiality and difference as a first step, and then a kind of differentiation as a second, would bespeak that view, right? A view that one might find, for instance, in a certain reading of Debord or a certain reading of Adorno, perhaps, even. But I definitely think that the point about finance is a striking one. I mean, I think it would be here interesting to reflect more concretely, perhaps, on the ways, right, in which this evacuation and rearticulation of social differences takes place. So, I'm thinking, for instance, of a lot of interesting work, some of which for instance, by Gary Dymski, was published in the pages of Historical Materialism on the racial dimensions of the subprime mortgage crisis, speaking of the 2007-8 moment, and of the ways in which, you know, through these various financial devices and vehicles, the concreteness of the social difference and domination that determined, let's say, you know, mortgage markets in US cities was invisibilized in a very systematic and in a kind of willful sense. But then, of course, it required the concreteness and the history of these forms of racial capitalism to operate, right? And so, in some sense, the difference are transcoded, are refunctioned, but nevertheless they're not they're not simply internal to capitalism, right? They're not simply that would be like a metaphysical reading of these abstractions that would just take it as read, that somehow the entirety of the social field and of the social world is always already imminent to capital, which I think would be a sort of very problematic perspective. But yeah, so I'll leave that there.
Great. So just as a quick reminder for everybody, you are free to unmute yourself and ask the question live. We want this to be a back and forth dialogue. This should not be a simple monologue. So please definitely turn on your camera and unmute yourself and ask the question live. Thank you. I see.
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So it's interesting about Sohn-Rethel, because you sort of drew attention earlier to the, I think, substantial debates about the viability of the way he situates real abstraction within the context of ancient Greece, because of debates about the insistence that real abstraction and sort of accompanying metaphysics have to issue from abstract labor, in a sense. And I think, I see that debate as a bit of a red herring in a way, because I think there's a lot of, not all, but there's a lot of readings of Marx, in a tradition really going back to Engels, but we could talk about, Mendel, many others, in which, the development of the commodity form and moreover, Jacques Bidet as well, but the development of the commodity form and the abstraction of labor is treated as sort of progressive and historical, right? Rather than kind of occurring in this instantaneous way, which is kind of my critique of Postone in general. Is I think that he negates this historical development in some way. But without dwelling on that too much, when I say it's a red herring, I mean because I think there are certain other issues about intellectual and manual labor that are more sort of vexing in a way, given the ready defenses at hand for the notion of a kind of historicization of abstract labor. So I think one, for example, is the way that, you talked about the difficulties associated with first philosophy, right? And I think, it's very, very, plausible in a way to use Sohn-Rethel's work to try to progress towards a kind of despiritualization of philosophical discourse. But there still is a kind of, there are certain assumptions which the inquiry nevertheless requires, right, to kind of get off the ground. So I think in Intellectual and Manual Labor, citing Marx, he talks about the parallel between social being and consciousness as being essential to his sort of inquiry, right? So we have a kind of I hesitate to say sort of base infrastructure, superstructure kind of thing, but this is quite central to his whole project. And then one has to question where that comes from, right? Because I think certainly one of the tendencies in terms of dispensing with a kind of vulgar materialism, if you will, has been to try to historicize the tendency to like materialism itself, right? To say, well, well, materialism is in a sense justifiable because capitalism functions in that manner, right? That's its structural operation, right? Rather than treating it as a kind of abstract historical posit. But you can see this is foundational to the way that Sohn-Rethel actually analyzes history. For my part, I've been led to explore some of Bernard Stiegler's, discussions in his work about the relationship between tools and language and this kind of thing as a potential way of getting to the root of that. But the other one is actually in your second essay where you deal with Zizek. One thing you say, and I'd be interested to know exactly. I mean, I guess it's the idea of like, how nature becomes conceptualized as a kind of congealed physical object world, right? In the context of the sciences, once real abstraction kind of takes hold. But you say at one point that for Sohn-Rethel, use value necessarily appears as a kind of it's a kind of metaphysical postulate that accompanies the development of exchange, right, in that vein. But this is already a little tricky, I think, because it seems to me that if we look at the way that Sohn-Rethel deploys in a rather ahistorical manner, the notion of manual labor, that it's already incumbent, I think, to some extent, upon a notion of use value or a sort of notion of a sort of fungible characteristic of labor, which is always there, which is quite outside, right, of these kind of schematizations that he develops. So I wasn't entirely sure about that line and the way you used it. But yeah, so these are, I guess, to me, I think that these questions in a way are, in my opinion, anyway, I think the more pressing questions about Sohn-Rethel's work than the question about abstract labor in history.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Conrad. I mean, I think maybe to address the last point first, one avenue maybe of consolidating that criticism of Sohn-Rethel would be, in a way, to apply that that distinction that Rubin makes, right, between material categories and social forms, and to say that actually, despite what is, to my mind, still this very suggestive and partly pioneering take on the social genesis or practical genesis of abstract forms, that Sohn-Rethel, and I think you're right, does maintain remarkably, in its own way, vulgar, right? Or a remarkably unreflexive. He doesn't. The striking thing is that the categories, the analysis, the critique of epistemology is not iterated back into his own account, right? So it's almost as if he has a relatively uncritical, a relatively traditional take, right, of relationships between being and consciousness, the treatment that, the discussion then when it gets into a more contemporary vein of the question of labor and production seems again to be seems again to retain those material categories, right, to retain a kind of trans-historical character to labor or productivity or needs in a way that doesn't seem, right, to apply his own critical work back into those categories. And I think so in some way I think to do justice to the insight, to the kind of quite modular insight about how Sohn-Rethel posits a kind of static genesis of form in the act of exchange. In order to mobilize it, one would have to create a very different, a very differently arranged both historical and theoretical account to give it its force, right? Because I do think, and in that sense, I think it is also open to a kind of imminent critique, because it's almost as if, he provides this, scandalous, to use Zizek's terms, genesis of philosophy, and then seems at other points to use theoretical or philosophical categories that were generated by his own account, right, in the abstractions of exchange, without much critique or reflection. So that I think is quite suggestive. I think one of the problems, and I guess it's another way of dealing with the vexed recursive problem of the sort of should capital be grasped historically or logically, etc. I think what's interesting in Sohn-Rethel's moment is that there is a kind of historicity to ahistoricity, right? Like there's a historicity and a practical character to forms that make practice and history in a sense invisible, right? Mm-hmm. What is curious in Sohn-Rethel's account, and I think it's worth perhaps dwelling with, but maybe not in the ways that he intended to, is, what if, like, let's say, like as a hypothesis, like, what if this is the key moment, like this exchange abstraction in the Greek agora, blah, 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 is the key moment for philosophies, for the generation of a particular speculative thinking of abstraction in ancient Greece, concepts of substance, quantitative treatment of matter and time and whatever. But what if it has nothing to do with capitalism whatsoever, right? Which would be a perfectly historically consistent claim, right? So what does it mean? And this might then go back to also Seaford's account. What does it mean that something has to do with exchange, has to do with money, but is just radically discontinuous, right? With the history of capital, or indeed with the history of abstract labor. And I think that, and that also means that one might have to disaggregate the presupposition of totality, that somehow all of these things are organically linked, right? Well, what if this history is an evental history that's radically discontinuous? That, then these real abstractions that have made possible philosophical speculation are then refunctioned and transformed with the emergence of abstract labor, like 2,000 years later, right? Or its socially efficacious emergence. And then, of course, that would be to use Sohn-Rethel in a way quite inimical, perhaps, to the way that he intended to be used. But that might be, and that that would involve thinking of this discontinuous relationship between the social emergence of abstraction in a totally philosophical abstraction in a non or pre, or just non, because it wasn't pre until later, right? Non-capitalist setting. The Greeks are not pre-capitalists. That wouldn't make, unless you have some weird teleological history, they weren't pre. And then that this is refunctioned and kind of transformed, and therefore you would need, that would also that would require rethinking the historicity of those abstractions. And in that sense, that would sort of take me a little bit back to that claim in Deleuze and Guattari of this sort of principle of contingent reason, right? There isn't, it's not a miracle, and it's not teleologically or continuously linked to what happens afterwards. And I think there's also, I wrote a short piece in a symposium about a very interesting book called Divine Currency by Devin Singh that was published recently. There's a whole other, this might be a formative moment, but then, there's strata and transformations in the nature of the relationship between theoretical abstractions and monetary or economic forms in Europe and elsewhere that are extremely consequential, right? So, the whole over, like as Singh carries it out into late antiquity, like the whole overdetermination of theology by monetary and economic categories with massive social and intellectual and indeed philosophical consequences is something that, you know, Sohn-Rethel can't tell you anything about, right? The way in which theological forms and economic forms, right? Concepts like redemption, like credit, like belief, you know, all of these are not easily contained. And that was to move it maybe to another sort of debate of sorts. That's what I've found. What I find deeply problematic in accounts, whether Marxian or otherwise, that see these histories of abstraction under the aegis of a kind of genealogical or philosophical historical continuity, right? Like one example being, since I mentioned, you know, theological matters, would be Agamben's Kingdom and the Glory, right? So basically accounts that see the relationship between economic forms and thought forms, right? To use the sort of Sohn-Rethelian mode within these kind of, you know, histories of being, right? Where somehow there is no discontinuity, right? There is no, in the end, there isn't really a kind of contingency, and I would rather, in a sense, or I find it more persuasive to not take for granted that these histories are always already totalized by teleologies, whether Heideggerian or pseudo-Marxian in kind. And in that sense, I think, you know, just to finish on that, I think maybe to do justice to the insight, just to the insight, not the book of Sohn-Rethel, but like the insight of Sohn-Rethel about the situation in which the abstraction is the practical element, to go back to your point, right, about use value, right? And within that exchange abstraction, then concreteness is abstract, right? Concreteness is like, oh, what I will do with this product, what is it for, etc. But actually, what is real and concrete is the exchange. The use value is parasitic on it. It's that logic, that insight, I think cannot be necessarily done justice to by Sohn-Rethel's own categories, because I think, as I think you suggested too, they rely on and presuppose a kind of social ontology, right? That they can't sustain if you're indeed engaging in a critique of philosophical categories. So it's, you know, it's like you can't. You know, just, you know, for the same reason that I think it's ultimately untenable to engage in to critically employ the category of abstract labor while just thinking there is this thing that human beings have been doing forever called labor, of which abstract labor is just a distortion. And I think that's a risk in the Sohn-Rethel. There was a hand up from Liam, I think, or Dan, are you raising hands?
I was just going to bring the mic to Liam. So Liam, if you want to ask a question, please feel free.
Yeah, sure. There's some questions in the chat. If you want to address those first, or shall I just jump in?
You are free to just jump into your own question since you have the mic, please.
Sure. Changing the subject a bit and going to the Cremonini essay. There's a very interesting, because I'm very interested in question of aesthetics, sort of what if there's such thing as a Marxist aesthetics. And there's an interesting passage in the Cremonini essay where Althusser talks about the affect related to Cremonini's paintings that actively reject recognition in a humanist sense. You know, we don't look at these paintings and see some kind of existential reflection of ourselves, so to say. But then he changes tack and uses recognition again, the same words, at least in the English translation, to refer to the sort of the dialectical materialist method of Cremonini that reveals and allows us to recognize these relations of real abstraction. So I was just interested if I can phrase the question in some way. Would a Marxist aesthetics or a sort of materialist aesthetics, and you kind of point to that at the end of in the conclusion of cartographies, would it be sort of unashamedly didactic, sort of to put it that in that sense? Is the task, I don't want to use that word, of materialist aesthetics to allow us to make visible, as Althusser says, these concealed, or these concealed, sorry, a bit thick today, to reveal these concealed forms of real abstraction?
Yeah, I mean, the question of didacticism here is very tricky, right? Because didacticism seems to suggest a showing and indicating a revealing, right? In some sense, or and the problem conundrum that Althusser is gesturing towards, riffing on, however you want to put it, is the problem of the, in a sense of literally like the showing the invisible, right? Like showing the relations, relations which are not themselves simply materially instantiated, right? And this, this is, so the Cremonini essay then, I suppose, could also be read together with Althusser's engagements with other materials, as Warren Montag does brilliantly in his little book on Althusser, which was quite an inspiration for this. For instance, very much with the Brecht essay, right? The Brecht essay in For Marx, which is particularly interesting because, of course, Althusser there engages with a Brechtian take on melodrama, right?
On Bertolazzi.
On Bertolazzi, on melodrama, which is, of course, in some sense, like melodrama is like
the ideological sort of genre.
Yeah. But the brilliance, right? Like, what would and in some sense, I guess you could. And this is something that's somewhat tangentially raised by Jameson as well, right? Like, are there are there affects indeed? Are there like corporeal, sensory, aesthetic experiences that can be correlated with this showing of the abstract, right? Because I mean, otherwise we're not talking about an aesthetic. Otherwise, we're just reading Marx, which is fine, and maybe that's all we need to do, and iconoclasm is fine, and so on and so forth. But I think one of the things that is, and this becomes in a different guise, and maybe in a more interesting guise, also very present in Adorno's work, right? Because of the question. Okay, so on the one hand, we have this analysis of real abstraction as a kind of social unconscious, or philosophy unconscious of itself, or however you want to put it. And on the other hand, though, we have an emphasis on this corporeal, somatic, non-identical moment, right? Which is not, which is not something that's present in Sohn-Rethel as such. And I think I think Adorno in that sense is very, very interesting, especially to the extent that these matters are mediated by the specific formal and effective capacities of music, which is a very complicated issue that one could go into, but I think it definitely shapes his thinking about the nature of the nexus of aesthetics and abstraction. But this, the issue of what does it mean to do justice to two sides of materialism, so to speak, both of which, at least according to Adorno, are not done justice to by a dominant philosophical materialism within and without the Marxist tradition, right? So on the one hand, a kind of materialism of the body, like a materialism that also goes back to the kind of ancient materialisms that somebody like Sebastiano Timpanado was particularly, the materialisms of the body, the materialism of a mortal, finite body, and on the other hand, the materialism, this kind of materialism of the abstract, right? This materialism without matter, rather than, and this is a polemical choice, right? Rather than materialisms that would be speculative in the sense of trying to trace the chain of being, from the atom to the factory, right? And further, and that would therefore present and would therefore see the task of materialism as this kind of full, philosophy of the whole without any gaps that explains the genesis of everything and so on and so forth. And that is obviously in different ways, in quite different ways, neither Adorno's nor Althusser's position. They're in many ways struggling within and against the same, some of the same tendencies towards the notion that Marx needs to be supplemented with a kind of philosophy in a traditional, perhaps, kind of more 19th century sense, and instead turning, instead trying to think, and I think in that sense also we could talk about, the ways in which many of these figures at the same time as they're fixated on the problem of abstraction are also often trying to return to these very ancient, right, materialist inspirations that have to do with they're also Marx's first inspirations, right? Epicurean philosophy, right?
Democritus of the Creed.
And that's something actually that I haven't read the text in a long while, but there's a extremely interesting discussion of Marx's dissertation and the relationship between and the way in which Marx reads Epicurus and Epicurean and Democritean philosophy via Hegel and Roberto Finelli's book, The Failed Parasite, I think it's called, the one that was translated into into English. I think that's also a thread that one could follow. I don't know if that sort of it's a little bit of a drift improvisation on this, but I was recently for other reasons was reading a lot of Adorno's writing, specifically on music, and I do think it's an extremely rich terrain for revisiting that relationship between abstraction or real abstraction and the aesthetic in ways that the not just primarily, but at times kind of suffocatingly visual nature of debates, right, about the aesthetic kind of can kind of drown out, right, in some ways.
Thank you.
There was a question from Dan, and then I think there was a question from Chris in the
I'd like to let Martin as the next question live. So Martin, please.
I don't see Martin, or do I see Martin?
He is on the screen, camera on. So, and Martin, you are muted.
Okay, I've unmuted myself. Okay, sorry about that. So this might not resonate with this crowd, but I have a question that would require turning this discussion on its head. What if you looked at abstraction from the perspective of cognitive neuroscience? that the tendency toward abstraction could be rethought through, for example, Francisco Varela's notion of the specious present, where there is empirically a lag of time of a significant fraction of a second between the moment the senses pick up phenomenal experience and it registers with executive function, which we could also refer to in part as self-conscious awareness. So an abstraction of labor as capital, thought or otherwise, would be the result of a domination of slow cognition over fast cognition, which makes being in the moment, quote unquote, a hopeless obfuscation. An abstract theory of a cognitive process of abstraction would have the problem of not situating itself outside an abstract cognition. That a global ontology of transcendence, spatialization of time, etc., is built on a tendency of the human mind to remove itself from the concrete flow of events in the world. This could be diagnosed as a cultural pathology, such as discussed in the work recently in Cognitive Capitalism. So I'm wondering how you would respond to this kind of, if you don't mind the pun, an imminent critique of this approach to abstraction.
That's very interesting track to take. That would require considerable rumination, I think, to give a decent answer to. But I'll see what I can do. It's been decades since I've read Varela, but it does. The point about the present, I think, is really interesting because, of course, one of the very curious aspects of and striking aspects, I guess, of Sohn-Rethel's account of the exchange abstraction is precisely the vanishing. So the paradox, which he thinks is this epically generative paradox, right? It's a social act or a social practice taking place in very determinate space and time, in the market, in the agora, et cetera, but which in its form, in the form of this act, has to be thought of as happening outside of space and time, right? So this is like when he says something like, in the market, the commodity stands still, et cetera. Now, of course, we could argue.
Which has an ontotheological ground, right?
In what sense?
In timelessness.
Timelessness. But I guess what he wants to argue, I guess what he wants to suggest is that actually whatever ontotheology might make of it, this is a purely dumb, profane, banal, formal characteristic of this act, right? Whether people want to, and that actually there's a kind of projection from or sublimation of this stupid form of commodity exchange, which then has these enormous consequences, some of which are much more, like it's obvious that, the theories of matter or the cosmologies of the Greeks are far more interesting than them selling cheese to each other on a Tuesday. But nevertheless, it's the form of that act and its monetary, its complement in the specific history of monetization, which of course then if we read Seaford becomes very complicated because of course monetization is a deeply political act, which adds a whole other dimension of abstraction, which we haven't at all discussed yet. But to go back to your point, so that on the one hand, it just made me think that it's striking that one of the determinants of Sohn-Rethel's particular discussion of abstraction, but then also of other discussions of real abstraction, is precisely this this timelessness and sometimes spacelessness and sometimes not, but the kind of the temporal evacuation seems to be primary. Now, going back to that point, I think Catherine made regarding finance and the like, of course, now we see that, and also then, right, because these were already economies and forms of exchange with credit and debt, etc. So that self form then becomes embroiled in all sorts of practices that are temporally extremely complex, right, of promises and so on, right? So yes, the act of exchange might formally require the evacuation of time, but nobody would have money unless they were engaged in temporarily binding relationships of credit, debt, and so on. So we could also argue that even in the moment, that's quite, that you could also say that in itself vitiates a particular account of both philosophy and of monetary abstraction, not to think that from the start, and Agamben gets this though maybe in the wrong way in talking about credit and faith and so on, but this temporal projection, which then has all sorts of theological and social consequences, is certainly a part of it. Now, I haven't. It's very interesting to bring in the Varela also because, and cognitive and neurobiological debates in general, for a couple of reasons. I think also, I mean, one is that they force us to think through the relationship between the materiality or the biology of cognition and its historicity, which is of course not rarely dealt with, at least explicitly, in these kind of Marxian debates about abstraction. But also in the specific case that you mentioned, I think the point about the specious present and also reminds me of another kind of critical take on consciousness, which is sort of linked, which is that argument it was in Dennett's Consciousness Explained about the multiple drafts of consciousness, right? So the fact that, again, you have a kind of cognitive multiplicity, which is then sort of synthesized and gives a sort of effect, a sort of user illusion or an effect of unification. And that does raise an issue, which I think is very interesting about the subject, whether the exchanging subject or the social subject or the social individual itself as a product of abstraction. And
if I could create a parenthesis here.
Yeah, please.
You brought up Adorno.
Yeah.
Who actually hated jazz. And I'm actually working through these issues using jazz improvisation as a thought experiment. Mm-hmm. There's one thing, the great book that came out in the late 2000s called "This Is Your Brain on Music." Daniel Levitin's having a conversation with his hero Francis Crick, and they're talking about the fact that there are hardwires from the cochlea that bypass the prefrontal cortex, which is the normal areas which process sound, and go directly to areas associated with proprioception. Mm. In other words, bypassing a million years of evolutionary history. And these are the hardwires that are associated with flight or fight and startle reflexes. But these are also the hardwires that become transvalued through jazz performance. That these are the hardwires that generate joy, not fear, in the process, which also enables jazz musicians to interact with each other beneath the threshold of conscious awareness, and therefore bypassing executive function and that aspect of the specious present, which separates a human being from its own flows. So this becomes a really interesting way to think through these kinds of issues. And I'm wondering, since I don't know Zizek very well, I'm wondering whether any of the philosophers that you've been bringing to bear to talk on this, to think through these issues of abstraction, whether they locate in space and time places where the human being does not abstract.
I think that, I mean, I wanted to kind of stay for a second with the Adorno, because that there's an issue which a lot of people have puzzled with to various extents of success, right? Like, is Adorno's critique sounds very generous, whatever, his war on jazz. Are Adorno's writings on jazz, to what extent are they specific, right? To usually, which I think is problematic, the Adorno disciple will defend him by saying, oh, of course he was just listening to Benny Goodman, and if only he'd heard Ornette Coleman, or whatever, you could go on and on, right? Or but what I do think is interesting about those writings, and there are moments, for instance, in his writings about the Darmstadt school and informal music and the like, where there is, and some of the times when he touches on improvisation. One of the issues that I think is striking in Adorno is this notion that the non-identical somatic moment, which is in a sense a moment of a freedom, which is a freedom in as much as it's also freedom from one's bourgeois individual control, etc., is primary, but it's a very big but. It under conditions of total administration and commodification, it's like the prize, right, at the end of the most forbidding and in some sense abstract formal exercises imaginable, right? So, and his claim in a lot of those in some of those jazz essays and in some other writings where he's engaging in the critique of popular music, etc., is that it's not a claim that, oh, we must cede to the formally forbidding compositional, rhythmic, melodic, and harmonic structures of contemporary classical music, or however you want to call it, in order to keep us away, right, from affect. Is that unless that affect is an affect that is a freedom reached through those forms, then it's simply open to a kind of manipulation, right? Then it's simply basically it's the ad men and the radio researchers that are accessing our million-year-old brain to make more money, just to put it brutally. And in some sense, it's so I think what's interesting is that there isn't at all a denial of the effective unmastered moment, but it's a moment that, at least in his perspective, is only gained or attained through this kind of elaborate formal work, which immunizes oneself in some sense, right, against the manipulation and against the cliche, and then against the fact that one of the functions of the use of those somatic affective moments in popular culture is precisely to lock oneself into this kind of degraded form of individuality rather than to free oneself for some supposed collective kind of
But
experience.
here's the rub, and that is that the music which he valorizes, which is classical music, which is based on the ability to take music outside of time and to create architectonics through a form of this spatialization of time, which emerged through Renaissance counterpoint about the same time, particularly Baroque counterpoint, right at the same time that calculus was being developed, which is a similar kind attempt to abstract lived experience into a series of infinite still moments, then he's commenting on a symptom of abstraction, and yet saying that it's only through this willful abstraction that we can get back to the peak experiences of the lived moment, and you know, I'm wondering whether this is as problematic as my original question being raised to you in terms of a Marxist analysis of abstraction.
So just a second, we also need to move to other questions. Yeah. Okay.
So Edge has a question.
Well, hello, Alberto.
Hi.
I was reminded of this text by Rob Lucas of EndNote's fame while listening to the question that Conrad posed. He wrote a text called Error. I don't know if you read it in the last issue of EndNotes, where he talked about this logical and historical reading of capitalism as like synchronicity of capitalist totality and diachronicity of capitalism as a historical system. And I was thinking, like, maybe the difference between these two readings is dependent on our experience of agency itself, that rather than the other way around. So perhaps to mediate this gap between these two readings, one needs to develop a kind of theory of autonomy or agency itself through a philosophical anthropology post-humanism, maybe. I would like to hear your opinions on that.
So, dense and complicated point. I haven't read Rob's piece. I found it suggestive what you said about the fact that it's the choice in this parallax between between the synchronic and the diachronic has to do with our agency. But I just wanted to hear more about what you and or Lucas meant by that.
I think he was talking about, like, with synchronicity of capitalist totality, it's being simultaneous. So logical, the simultaneity of logical necessity of the value form, and then diachronicity is another kind of historical understanding of temporality. So what provoked me was that maybe in more barren times of revolutionary upheavals, with our agency being low, we tend more towards the diachronic or synchronic. And maybe in the 20s, the reason that the Second International was more historicist was because they were better organized.
The suggestive proposal reminds me a little bit of not dissimilar point made by Jameson in a piece called Periodizing the 60s about 68, about this being able to historicize these speculative or philosophical perspectives. But yeah, I think I'll just stay with that because I don't have anything. It's a very interesting point, but I don't have anything really to say about it at the moment, perhaps because it's demands a little bit too much speculative development. I wanted to thank also for the mentions of the texts on Adorno and jazz. The other one, which is very interesting, also by Fred Moten, is a text, I think it's from one of the more recent collections about, it's a response to Adorno's text on listening to opera on long playing records, which again, and he plays a lot on this question of the voice and the black voice of the opera singer. And so in any case, it's a very, very interesting engagement. And also linked to that, one can read that alongside actually Moten's critical take on Jameson's cognitive mapping essay, which is also in black and blur, which again brings up this issue, which only recently I've started to really think about, which is the ways in which these debates about these debates about the so-called aesthetics of cognitive mapping or aesthetics of the economy or totalization are then transformed and deflected by taking a much more musical angle on them. So we're almost done. So maybe we'll take Sanmit has his hand up, I think. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yeah.
My question actually addresses a different set of texts and different school of thought. But while reading your the first essay, Materialism Without Matter, so what I was thinking that materialism, as you have clearly addressed this question in your essay and in the discussion, that we these days sometimes we tend to think of materialism in terms of, materialism gets reduced to a vulgar sort of materialism, where materialism stands for immediate presence and what can be to some extent called, like some art critic has, literary critic has called matterity, as if something which is directly evolving from matter. So kind of reference to matter is very much there at the heart of their sort of materialism. And if we can, if you look at the present philosophical scenario in the continental theory, the development of new materialism, what talks about, and they pose a very, very strong criticism of post-structuralist thought in terms of that apparently post-structuralists reduce everything to language. But what I was thinking that the way this concept of real abstraction has been developed, whether is it possible to draw a parallel of this concept of real abstraction to, I don't know, it has not been written upon much yet, and Derrida or Derridians does not talk about materialism as such. And when Derrida was in an interview asked about materialism, he said that I can think of materialism only in terms of where the other is announced as such. And when we read post-structuralists like Judith Butler or Derrida, they always problematize the concept of presence. The subject is apparently there, very immediate. The matter is apparently there, very immediate. But the moment we try to approach the subject, it's kind of, it disperses into language, into power, into many other structures of thought, many structures of social formation, social categories, many other things. So I was thinking if it's possible to draw a parallel of this concept of real abstraction to how post-structuralists problematize the concept of materiality in general. And yeah, that would be all. I'm not sure if it's impertinent, but
No, I think it's very relevant, though it's definitely not something I can answer in 4 minutes. No, I mean, I think I definitely think whether it's I mean, certainly in Derrida, whether it's maybe not so much actually in Spectres of Marx, but in other writings in terms of the debates in, broadly speaking, deconstructive literary criticism around Paul de Man and the like on materiality, or whether we also enter into the discussions of materiality that come from a more psychoanalytic angle and so on and so forth. I think yes, it's a very rich terrain, and there's also a whole number of figures maybe less well known in the English-speaking world that emerge out of those 60s, 70s debates that deal much more specifically with questions of real abstraction understood in terms of the relation between social form, literary form, monetary form, and the like Jean-Joseph Gou's books on symbolic economies. And so there's a very rich set of, if slightly minor set of debates around these issues that I think it would be worth returning to. But maybe I can talk about that more next time. And maybe, those of you, I've found this extremely stimulating and wanted to thank everybody for your questions and comments. I don't quite know how to save the chat, but maybe Dan, you will, so I don't lose thoughts that have been raised along the way. And maybe Conrad, you can keep your, because I have to go at 11 on the dot, but maybe you can save your point for when we meet next Saturday.
Yeah, for sure.
That's all right. That's brilliant. Okay. Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. And yeah, I'll try to do justice to some of these comments and questions when we meet next week then.